I will be taking over the responsibilities of the chairperson. And our first speaker is Ram Tirumalai. And I think the discussant for this is Nidhi Agarwal. And both participants are here, therefore we shall commence. Okay. Bong. Ram.
Thanks a lot, Susan. Thanks for having this paper on the conference. And so thanks to Jyoti and Unnati for help with all the administrative stuff. This is a paper co-authored with Deepak and Prasanna who are at ISB, and KR is basically at the University of Southern California, but he's been spending the last couple of years at ISB. So he's right now at ISB. So this is co-authored with the three of them. And I don't know, I think this to be a fairly simple paper. I mean, we've all been in situations at conferences and seminars where you're saying, oh damn, that's such a simple paper, why didn't I think of it? Hopefully after I do my paper, you think the same. I hope I have the satisfaction of being on the other side today and saying, you guys thinking, hey, that's a simple paper, why didn't I think of it? Anyway, the question is pretty straightforward, do derivatives matter? We're basically looking at a policy experiment from India from a couple of years back. So we basically use an exogenous derivative exclusion event to address the broad question as to whether and in which direction derivatives affect the underlying stock prices. I mean, there's a wealth of literature on this, going back to Black and Scholes' seminal paper on option pricing, whether derivatives do impact underlying stock. In perfect markets, clearly the way Black and Scholes and some of the other papers subsequent to that show that derivatives are kind of redundant securities. They can be replicated using the stock and the underlying stock and bonds. But then in imperfect markets, maybe derivatives do matter. So there's again a lot of literature and the evidence is mixed. So the answer is yes, if there is impact, they do impact. Again, some people find there's a positive impact on underlying stock when derivatives are introduced, and then there is other maybe a little more recent literature that shows that there's a negative impact on underlying stock because they alleviate short sale constraints. And there is also literature that shows that derivatives do not impact the underlying asset, right? So no additional information conveyed, no impact of large options trade on stock prices and liquidity. Right, so the basic problem with existing literature in this area is an issue of identification. Right, a number of papers, basically, most of the papers that I've listed here use either options listing or options delisting as an event and say study what is the impact of the listing or delisting on the underlying stock prices and stock market quality. And there's this paper about a decade back by Mayhew and Mihov, a couple of papers, where they kind of show that the decision to list options on exchanges is endogenous. So even if you take stocks that could have been listed on exchanges but are for whatever reasons not listed, they find that they also kind of behave similar to how the stocks who have options listed behave. So they kind of say that the decision itself to whether to let a stock have options traded or not is endogenous. And I think kind of the debate largely, I don't know, at least to my knowledge, ended there. And there are other studies that examine the impact of the extent of derivative, just the magnitude, how much more options volume, how does it impact prices, stock market liquidity, etc. Again, the criticism there is the cross-sectional variation in trading, options trading volume may be just a function of some unobservable variables. So Ni et al. About a decade back conclude basically that the extent literature has not shown if equity option trading significantly impacts the underlying stock, right? And all this is just a question of identification, right? So luckily for us, on July 23rd, 2012, SEBI changed the criteria for continued listing in the futures and options segment in India. So the next day, the NSE announced the list, and the BSE also announced a list of 51 stocks that would stop trading in the F&O segment once the existing set of contracts expired. And so as on the date of announcement, July, August, and September contracts were trading, right? Your near month, next month, and far month contracts. Basically, they were allowed to expire as per schedule, and then those stocks would cease trading in the F&O segment. We use the event date, the announcement date, to be a couple of days later because 23rd July, SEBI announced, 24th July, NSE announced the list, but they announced the list after markets closed. So then we say, okay, when the market opened on July 25th, that should be our event date. So we use that as one of our event dates. And the other one is the actual expiration date of the contract, the last contract in September, namely September 27th. So these are our two event dates. A little bit about the criteria, the event itself. So there are three criteria that need to be met for a stock to continue to be in the F&O segment. I think they revisit this, I think, every month or every quarter. I don't remember the exact frequency, but they look at the stock on a periodic basis and see whether they meet all these three criteria. If they violate even one of these criteria, they're excluded. Just kind of quickly, in case you're not familiar, quickly define what the three criteria is. You have the MWPL, the market-wide position limit, which is typically 20% of the free float, right, the non-promoter holdings. You have a median quarter sigma order size, MQSOS. Basically, it's saying what is the median order size over the last 6 months required to move the bid-ask midpoint by 1/4 of the historical standard deviation of returns. And then they actually introduced a new criteria, this MMT, the minimum monthly turnover. So they said the average monthly turnover in value terms over the prior 3 months must meet the MMT, minimum monthly turnover. And basically, these are the criteria before the change. MWPL was 60 crores, it went up to 200 crores. The MQSOS was 2 lakhs and it was increased to 5 lakhs. The MMT did not exist before, it was a new criteria, and that was 100 crores, right? So these are the earlier limits and the new limits after the change. And because of the increase in these three limits, 50 stocks got excluded, and these are the reasons for exclusion, right? Even if they violated one criteria, they were excluded. Of the 50 stocks, 5 were excluded because they didn't meet the MQSOS criteria. 30 were the largest number, basically because they didn't meet the market-wide position limit. 4 were because of their not meeting the MMT, and then there were a few that kind of didn't meet two of the three criteria, and one that didn't meet 3 of the criteria. Right? So these are the reasons why they were excluded. Right? So kind of moving on to our hypothesis, how do we expect the markets to react to this event? So one could be prices increase after the F&O stock is excluded from the F&O segment. And this could be a reason. One reason, again, tying it back to the existing literature, is because now the stock is no longer trading in the F&O segment. There are now short sale constraints. So which means positive news will dominate negative news. So you might see a price increase. And another liquidity-based reason is now, earlier when you had an F&O and the cash segment, some of the order flow was going to the cash segment, some of it was going to the F&O segment. Now that you got rid of the F&O segment, there's a consolidation of order flow. So all the orders go only to the cash segment. So it could be that the cash market becomes more liquid. And in the context of the Amywood-Mendelson classic 1986 paper, we could say that prices are going to increase because of the improved liquidity. A second reason for an alternate explanation for alternate hypothesis is prices could decrease after they excluded from the F&O segment. And this could just be the overall, because of reduced liquidity. Some of the liquidity in the cash market might be because of hedgers. People have open positions in the derivative segment. They need to go out and hedge that open position in the derivatives in the underlying cash. So now that the F&O segment doesn't exist, these guys maybe just exit the market because there's no need to hedge using the underlying cash. So there could be a reduction in the liquidity of the underlying stock market. A third could just be a short-term price pressure impact, where we see some really maybe a few days or a couple of weeks prices drop, but then again, these guys don't need to hedge. So that could just be that these guys make a temporary dump of the shares in the market, which are absorbed by other traders, and then they kind of prices revert, right? So these are 3 alternate expectations of what's going to happen to the price. Price efficiency could improve after the exclusion, because one reason could be that because the F&O segment in India is I mean, not only in India, like F&O gives you leveraged positions. So that means people who don't have much money, typically the small traders, could be trading a lot, and I think it's kind of documented. A lot of the F&O trading in India is because of individuals. So maybe these guys exit the market because it's too expensive for them to trade in the cash market. And also the STT is higher in the cash market, right? So there's an added cost of the trading in the cash market. So maybe once these guys exit, again, there's a lot of debate as to whether short-term noise traders are good or bad for the market. So you could make a case that if they exit, a lot of the noise goes, so maybe efficiency improves. A second reason, an alternate explanation could be that price efficiency worsens after they excluded, because a lot of the informed trader, given the leverage and the low cost of trading in the F&O, prefer trading in the F&O segment. Once the F&O is shut down, then the costs, information costs are too high, and trading in the cash market is not too profitable. So maybe price efficiency goes down once the F&O segment is closed. Quickly on the data, NSE, we get data from 4 sources. We have some of the data is from the NSE website. So basically the list of firms excluded due to the change in criteria is from the website. Historical data on the 3 criteria also come from the exchange website, as well as the F&O segment trading volume comes from the website. Provis, we use standard market information, price, stock market or cash market volume, market capitalization, turnover, as well as some of the company level financial information like sales, total assets, and price to book also come from Provis. SEBI, we just get some of the circulars on the listing and delisting norms so that we make sure that we understood the circulars and the regulations clearly. And then we also get some analyst coverage information at a quarterly frequency from Bloomberg. Right, so these are largely our data sources. So one possible explanation for what we see is just regulatory targeting. Why did SEBI increase the limits? Maybe they were trying to get rid of certain types of firms. So there was these guys were already on a downward trend. SEBI kind of figured that, well, in 3-4 months, these guys are anyway, given the downward trend, they're going to exit the segment. So let's kind of push those numbers up so that we can now get those guys out of the F&O segment early, right? So we look at the trends in the 3 measures. The lighter gray, I hope you can see, the lighter gray lines at the bottom are the criteria, that the new criteria for those 3 measures, and the black ones are basically how the company's measures were over the 5-6 months prior to the change in the criteria by SEBI, right? So mostly these guys are flat. So there seems to be, we kind of say that this is not necessarily regulatory targeting. It's not that these guys are already going down. SEBI moved up the criteria so that you can get rid of these stocks automatically. So there doesn't seem to be any, actually visually, at least visually, there doesn't seem to be any regulatory targeting of these companies by SEBI. Just some summary stats. We have excluded firms, 50 were excluded. There were 154 firms that continued to trade in the F&O segment, and we use the continuing firms as our control sample. And we can see that pretty much along any dimension, the firms that were excluded were small, relatively smaller firms in terms of total assets, sales, market cap. Of course, the 3 measures, of course, they are going to be lower because they were close to the criteria, they got excluded. Price to book ratio is surprisingly not different for the 2 sets of firms. Profit to sales, again, profit to sales was lower for the excluded firms. And again, the cash market and the F&O volumes were also lower for the excluded firms when compared to the continuing firms. So all we are going to do, since it's an exogenous event, we're just going to do a bunch of tests using difference and difference framework. So our control firms are largely going to be the continuing firms, the 154 firms that continue to trade in the F&O segment. And of course, our treatment firms are going to be the 50 that got thrown out of the, actually, I don't know, that were kind of delisted from the F&O segment. Standard event study methodology, first to study the price impact of this event. We use the CNX 200 index as a proxy for the market. Our estimation window is from day minus 275 to day minus 26 prior to the announcement date, the NSE announcement date of those 50 stocks. T-stats, we kind of calculate using the cross-sectional method from Bomer et al. And then we just given that all the 50 companies are affected on the same day, there's some potential for some cross-sectional correlation. So we also do the adjust for the event clustering that's outlined in Collari and Pinonen, right? So this is our first set of price impact results. So the left-hand side is your cumulative abnormal returns. Right-hand side is your abnormal returns. We kind of also report medians because 50 may be a little small. Maybe we lack a little bit of power, but so we also include our median. So yeah, if you look at this, the numbers out here are not significant. Day 0 is the day NSE announced the 50 stocks that were excluded. So the abnormal return on that day was a minus 2%. And then there seems to be a 1-day gap and then a minus 2.25% abnormal return on day +2 after the announcement by NSE. And after 5 days, a total cumulative abnormal return, which is significant, is of minus 2.82%, which is pretty large. And if you look at the couple of days before that, the cumulative abnormal returns go as high as about minus 4%. So this is a market reaction to the announcement, right? Right after the day after NSE announced the list of 50 stocks. We also look at the actual exclusion, right? That was September 27th, the last contract expired, and we looked at what happened. There's not much action happening out here. If you look at the abnormal returns, they're pretty flat. But if you look at the cumulative abnormal returns, yeah, maybe a little high out here, close to about 2% out here, minus 2%. Right, so then we kind of say, okay, what is the total impact of this exclusion? Let's say that there is some reaction around the announcement and some reaction around the exclusion itself. So kind of we just do a complete continuous cumulative. We take those 11 days and then these 7 days and add them up. So the net impact is of about minus 4% across. This is 11 and this is 7 days. So around this 18-day window, we have a negative 4%, which is pretty significant. I mean, this is the mean is significant at the 10%, at the median is significant at the 1% level. So we kind of plotted, okay, do prices revert? Maybe they revert at some point in time. So the first vertical line out here is the day NSE, July 25th, the day after NSE announced the list of 50 stocks. And this is day 45, which is September 27th, the last day, the day the last contract expired. You see a lot of the price reaction it happens between the announcement and the actual exclusion. It kind of drops about 4% out here and then has a slow downward trajectory up to about -7, -8% out here. And then, I don't know, this is a little more down, further down, I don't know, we don't know. We are unable to explain this downward trend, but it's kind of flat for the most part after that. So this is using all the 50 stocks, but the potential problem with using all 50 stocks that are excluded is some were excluded not, if you remember this table out here, some were not excluded because of MWPL, they're excluded because of this MQ, SOS and MMT, which are both liquidity measures. So you could, again, even though our figure 1 shows that these measures are all flat prior to SEBI's announcement or SEBI's change, it could be that maybe these measures were in some downward trend which we are not able to observe. So we said, well, let's look at only MWPL. So MWPL depends only on free float, and free float kind of tends to be sticky. It's going to be very difficult for me to be constantly changing it because that would require the promoter to sell or buy stake in the company. So we say, well, let's only focus on stocks that are the 30 stocks that were excluded because of a low market-wide position limit, because these free float tends to be very sticky, right? And our results actually tend to be even stronger. So if you look out here, this is for the entire, across both the windows, the announcement as well as the actual exclusion. It's about a -6 to -7% across the 11 plus 7, 18-day window, about a 6-7% loss in value once the derivative was, once the stock was excluded from the F&O segment. So it's a pretty strong result once we look at only MWPL, and again we look at a plot for this. Again, you can see a lot of the action happened between the announcement and the actual exclusion. Right? So our results become stronger once we focus only on the exclusions that are based purely on the MWPL, which may address, looking at only the MWPL based exclusions may address any further concerns of endogeneity, saying that MQ, SOS and MMT are anyway liquidity based measures, so maybe there is something going there. This kind of gives us even stronger results. So we say maybe a little more, any other further concerns on endogeneity is also hopefully addressed by this cut of our data. And then we do a couple of other robustness tests which are not reported in the paper. We look at placebo event dates. Placebo event dates, basically we use the new criteria announced on July 23rd, and then use those criteria and say go back to 2010 and 11 and say what if
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Oh wow. So go back and say what happens if these stocks had been, if these criteria had been introduced earlier, and we find that there is no significant price reaction around the placebo event dates. False limit tests also we use the same event date but then change the limits, the criteria themselves. Again, no significant price reaction. So basically, basic idea out here is prices decrease after stock stops trading in the F&O segment, and this decrease appears to be permanent, right? And then we look at a whole bunch of liquidity measures and price efficiency measures. Liquidity, we look at abnormal volumes, and we find that abnormal volumes, even though the price reaction was here around the announcement, a lot of the abnormal volume, the volume drops only around the exclusion and after the exclusion, actual exclusion of the stock from the F&O segment. We do like a large list of liquidity measures, and pretty much every single liquidity measure says the liquidity worsens, right? Look at trade size, average trade size, trade volume, turnover, Amihud illiquidity measures, roll impact measure, everything very consistently says that liquidity worsens when a stock is excluded from an F&O segment. And then we look at price efficiency also. I'm not going to bore you with this. This is kind of tells us what the methodology is. You're just regressing returns, stock returns on market returns and lagged market returns. So if efficiency worsens, we'll find a larger impact of those lagged market return measures. And we do find that the efficiency, I would say these are inefficiency measures, so the inefficiency increases after the stocks are excluded from the F&O segment. So that is in terms of price efficiency. We also look at analyst coverage. Do fewer analysts start following the stock? And the answer is yes. Between 3 and 4 analysts lower after the stock is excluded from the F&O segment. And finally, the impact of volatility. Derivatives trading is always linked to volatility. I don't know, regulators say it's a bad, derivatives are bad for volatility. But we actually find some weak results out here that actually volatility goes up after F&O's stock is excluded from F&O. And here we kind of look at negative downside volatility versus upside volatility. We find that downside volatility goes up, upside volatility actually increases. And then we look at skewness and kurtosis. We find skewness and kurtosis also increase after the stock is excluded from the F&O segment, right? So I don't know, the results on volatility are not too strong, but it does seem to say that maybe volatility actually doesn't decrease as the regulator would expect once stock is excluded from the F&O segment. So I'm done. So prices are negatively impacted when a stock is excluded from the F&O segment, and the price change seems to be permanent. It's not like a temporary price pressure effect. Liquidity worsens, price efficiency worsens, and there is some evidence that volatility in fact increases after F&O exclusion, though it's not kind of clean, right? So since this session is called Markets and Policy, I said, well, from a policy perspective, derivatives appear to be good for price efficiency and liquidity and not necessarily bad for volatility, right? Thanks a lot.
Can I ask Nidhi to come up and do her discussion presentation?
Hello everyone. First of all, I think Ram has done a very good job of explaining the paper, but I'll still do a quick summary. So as everybody now knows, this paper examines the impact of derivatives on stock valuation, price efficiency, and underlying liquidity. And the beautiful thing that the paper has is that it exploits a policy intervention when the Indian regulator raised the minimum threshold to allow a stock to continue on trading on derivatives. And as Ram has just said, so the major findings are that stock valuation is impacted adversely after the exclusion from derivative segment. Price efficiency reduces, stock liquidity reduces, and no major impact on stock price volatility. The little that they find is that for stocks that get excluded, actually experience a larger volatility. So the ultimate takeaway from the paper is that the derivatives indeed matter. So overall, I think it's a very well executed study while accounting for endogeneity issues. So if you read the paper has spent a lot of time in explaining how it tackles the major endogeneity issue, and that happens with the use of the NEAT policy experiment that we have got. And so I think the contribution of the paper is twofold. One is in terms of policy importance. Role of derivatives in India, especially in India, is like question whether it's commodity derivatives or it is stock derivatives, and it's often that people say that this is meant only for speculation, but and the findings of the paper suggest that derivatives indeed help improving the stock fundamentals as well. So I think it has got important policy implementation. In terms of academic contribution, again, there is a lot of literature which, as Ram said, examines whether there is a real role for derivatives in the market or not. So it adds to the existing evidence, and how it distinguishes from the rest of the literature is by exploiting the natural experiment. So I think that's the key aspect of it in terms of using this and finding out what happens when derivatives get excluded, and the way it has been executed, it lends credibility to the main results. So mostly, I think I found that the paper has been well implemented. Most of the what I'll discuss now are clarificatory questions. So one is a very simple question of why CNX 200 instead of a Nifty 50, which is a market index representative. So a clarificatory question, not as to anything much important. Second is matching techniques. So the paper mentions that you have done a matching using Das et al. Methodology. So I could not get a sense of what are the covariates that are being used, because Das et al. Is primarily on bonds market, and they've used time to maturity and rating on the bond, etc. So I did not understand what are the covariates, and typically if you look at equity market papers, so the two variables that are used to match are market cap and price. So that could be a suggestion for matching. Then paper and all the robustness results report that match sample has also been used, and the results are similar. But the results that are shown are for pooled control sample. And my sense is that when you have a Reliance and an ONGC treated there as the control sample, and you are capturing liquidity variation, much of the effect will die out. So why would you not include a match sample result also in the paper? In terms of price efficiency, the price efficiency right now are measuring the impact of price incorporation from market news. So my question that occurred to me was, why not to include firm-specific information also? So you, in your price delay measures, you include lagged stock returns as well, and determine what's the impact. Then liquidity measures. So the place where I got a little confused was to capture why do we include derivatives volume to understand the underlying stock liquidity if you want to capture the effect of derivative exclusion on this. So, and if we can add some price impact, has already been added in terms of rules measure, but bid ask to give a better sense of transactions cost. And I know that regression discontinuity, which is the first thought that came to me when there's such a neat experiment. So I know the past paper, the previous version of the paper had regression discontinuities. Just a mention as to why have you decided to exclude it? Was there anything? Any particular reason for it? Now the other two slides will be on just suggestions. So the paper right now is examining short selling constraints in the context of price movement after the exclusion. And this is big for the Indian market. We have short selling constraints on the spot market, and hence derivatives have an even important role when it comes to India. So for the little work that I have done, I understand that when a derivative is listed on a spot, then the spot prices to negative news is better than for a stock that is not listed. So and there is whole lot of literature, and in the recent space there are two papers. One is by Phillips 2011, that's a JBF paper, and which examined options introduction and how it mitigated, whether they mitigate the short selling constraints or not, and they find they did. And similarly, this is Weber and Pagano paper, which was analyzing impact of short selling bans across the world. And they found that for securities which have listed options, they had a lower impact in terms of price efficiency or not. So my only suggestion is, is it possible to examine whether prices now incorporate negative news on the spot market in a slower manner than before? And there's a very easy way of doing that, right? Price efficiency regression, you can just add a dummy for market returns and stock returns, whether they were negative or positive. So that is one. And the second thing, which is a much broader question, the current SEBI rules, so the rules that they are now, are they optimal or not? So whatever regulatory rules we have for derivative exclusion, what is the economic rationale behind that? Especially the MWPL limit, which is the market-wide position limit. What is the economic rationale? And I was trying to think as to whether a stock which has got lower market-wide position limit, if it gets traded on derivatives market, does it have a better chance of liquidity on the spot market after getting listed on derivatives or not? So the only question is, can derivatives mitigate the effect of higher insider ownership on a stock or not? So that may be maybe too large for this paper, but just a small discussion around that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I'll just follow in the footsteps of all the other chair people and open up the questions to the floor. Pradeep and Vardhana.
I have a few comments. Now, the criteria for, I mean, in ordinary, normal setting, this exogenous event is a thing of beauty for for academic researchers. So, you have a delisting event. Now, in this particular case, the delisting event is linked to a particular criteria, which relates to either the size of, either the volume of trading or the level of trading interest in the stock, and both of which, to my mind, are related to the volatility of the stock. So when you trade derivatives, one of the major rationales for trading derivatives is the fact that you are trying to capitalize on volatility, given that a lot of interest in trading derivatives is from speculators. So it is not that it's a random stock which has been delisted. It's a particular kind of stock. There is a selection bias in the kind of delisting which has taken place. So when we look at a study of this nature, where is Ram? Sorry. When you look at a study of this nature, I think I don't know why you are comparing it. You're doing all your analysis with a market-adjusted return, or a return which is adjusted in some sense, which has got a comparison sample which has got nothing to do with the kind of stocks which have been excluded. So if one has to do a study of this nature, one should really be comparing with what happens to a match sample of stocks which correspond to the kind of characteristics which have been delisted. The sample which has been delisted is, as you yourself pointed out, systematically different from the sample which exists afterwards. In particular, in terms of size, in particular in terms of volatility, in particular in terms of the amount of trading interest and liquidity which exists. So I would say that any kind of inferences that you draw from that are very suspect in that until you actually can credibly show that there is no effect for that. Number two, when you say the price decreases over and you lose value, I don't know why you're looking only at the event period when the actual announcement took place, and then again an event period which happened 6 months later when the actual delisting took place. If you say that the price change is permanent, we have to take into account the entire period over which that price change took place. You can't just take two slices of time, one on the date on which the delisting took place and one on the date on which the announcement took place, both of which suffer from the fact that there is a negative effect at that time. There is a negative perceptual effect which is taking place in those particular weeks. What is happening in the immediate weeks subsequent to the announcement, and what's happening in the immediate weeks subsequent to the delisting? So it has to be a cumulative, something like a long-term abnormal performance studies. That only then can one say that you're losing value. In terms of efficiency, I couldn't catch what the actual measure you used for price efficiency, but I would think that it is relevant since the paper has a policy perspective and it's a policy relevance. I would think it's important to look at not just pricing efficiency in the narrow sense of what happens in the next minute or next second. One has to look at pricing efficiency measures which are more longer term. If you were to look at, say, a period of a year or subsequent, and apply some kind of a Kalman filter methodology to get an underlying value, and then say ask the question: is the volatility of pricing errors greater after or lower after the whole process has taken place? Otherwise, we have a very narrow, almost trading-oriented outlook rather than something which can contribute to a policy perspective. Finally, I'm not out here to get you and keep criticizing. I'm just, it's meant to be a critique which is, from almost like a referee's perspective. I'm finding it difficult to understand. I know this is an this is an exogenous event. And that's the academically plus side for this. But there are a lot of studies which have taken place in this area, as you know. And all of those studies use a listing and a delisting event. And a listing and a delisting event is conditioned on some kind of an indicator. That listing or delisting event is fairly random. It's not that it's like a predictable event. And it is also conditioned on, say, volume, say, value, market value, or whatever. And here, what is different? You have a delisting event which is based on essentially a very small volume of trading, presumably linked to volatility, though you don't show that. I would think it's probably related to volatility, but I mean, in some sense, that's your basic criteria, and the volume is low. And I think the point Nidhi brought out at the end about the fact that it's that MWPL is related to the amount of somehow linked to insider ownership. That's kind of new, but nevertheless, it's not truly exogenous in that sense, and therefore, how is it different from the mass of studies that exist? If you want to sell it academically, you need to find some other way to sort of embellish that. Thank you. Great subject, though.
Vardhana and then Ajay. The default to chairperson. The default to
I have
chairperson.
a comment on this. You've written the paper to be a policy experiment on derivatives, and the way it seems it's more of a price discovery process, and the linkage between derivatives and underlying spot. When we look at it from the broader perspective of policy and making a statement on policy, I think you should also look at the other aspects of what drives the decision making of trading more on derivatives against the spots, because we have some other factors like the tax differential between the two asset categories, the contract size. So, what are the differentials from the macro perspective if you want to look at it from the policy angle? Yeah. Thank you.
Just to build on where Pradeep was going, I think so this is very good. I like the paper a lot, but can we push harder? The essence of what's going on is that the regulator has some rules and procedures which determines which stock gets removed from the derivatives list. For simplicity, let's imagine, just for purpose of argument, that there is only one number involved, it's market cap. Okay, I'm just making it up. That would have given a nice regression discontinuity design. Okay, so you would have some threshold of 1,000 crore, and there would have been a firm which dropped to 995 and it got thrown out. There would be a guy at 1005 who stayed in. So you would get a similar firm with similar characteristics, but one got a treatment and one did not. Now the rules are actually more complicated than that, but I'm just wondering whether the fundamental changes that Pradeep alludes to, so there's something happening to the vol of the stock, there's something happening to the liquidity of the stock. These things are not exactly exogenous. Okay, the regulator is just being the grim reaper, but he's reflecting a deeper phenomenon, that something is happening to this firm. And it should be possible to find matched partners who are experiencing something very similar. And then it becomes almost capricious. Then it's a quasi-experimental design that one of them got the grim reaper and one of them did not. okay, then I think you're fully done. That you've really got a completely exogenous event. That you've got a matched partner, the two are alike, there are some bad things happening, right? I mean, these are generally firms who are experiencing some difficulty, some distress, they're experiencing bad times. You've got two people, both of them similarly, and then there's an arbitrary administrative rule. So Nidhi mentioned a regression discontinuity design, and it's the intuition of a RDD, but really most real world policies are seldom unidimensional. Most real world policies don't permit that cute RDD graph, but the intuition of an RDD, that there's something purely arbitrary about some magic number 25, and there is one guy at 24, there's one guy at 26, for the rest, there are a lot alike. You match on that, you know, I think then you've got really plausible exogenous variation, and then the regulatory shock is an instrument, a perfect instrument, and I think you've got something.
So, are there-
By the way, my daughter whispered to me, super harsh. I didn't intend to be super harsh. It is
Ram, do you want to?
Thanks a lot for all the wonderful comments and questions. Thanks to Nidhi for all the wonderful comments. I'll try my best to address all the questions. First, why not the Nifty? Why the CNX? The Nifty, I think it goes back to the match sample, the regression continuity comment. The Nifty stocks tend to be very far bigger than the stocks that were excluded. So we do get this, the results are there economically, but statistically we were not, because of the large standard errors, we were not getting significance in that. That's the reason we didn't use the Nifty. And we looked at the size differences, they're huge. And then I think that goes to all the match sample comments, which I'll get to in just a bit. Propensity score, again, the problem with propensity score is we were not getting close enough propensity scores. The matches were kind of very far. That means we had to reduce our sample even further. I think it dropped to like 20 or 25. So then we kind of ran into power. So which is why we didn't do the propensity score matching in a specific way. We just kind of lumped all the F&O stocks together, existing, the ones that continued as a control sample. But I don't know, I agree, we maybe need to take a closer look at coming up with the propensities. Yeah, Ajay. Sure. Sure. Okay. We'll look at it. We'll definitely take a closer look at that. Stock price adjustment to firm specific information. We did look at, our papers, the too many tables we did in an earlier version have earnings surprises. And we do find that earnings surprises kind of go up after they're excluded from an F&O. But yeah, that's what I remember. I need to verify. It was there in an earlier version of the paper. Why F&O and cash market volume together? So one reason was basically it's possible that once you shut down the F&O segment, all the volume goes to cash market. So we want to just see the total volume for the entire stock, regardless of which segment it is in. And so we want to see whether the volume migrates or the volume exits the market. And we do find largely that the volume exits the market. There's no migration, and that might be tied to Vardhana's question on, well, there is a cost implication, the differential tax thing. So there are a bunch of people who are trading in the F&O because it's cheap, the STT is low. But the moment you shut down the F&O, these guys, instead of switching, they just altogether exit the market, given the higher STT in the cash segment. Regression discontinuity, we did have it in an earlier version. I need to see why we dropped it or whether it's an oversight. Ajay's point was on the discontinuity. We need to take a look at that. Slower reaction to negative returns, negative news. We haven't thought about that. We'll take a look. That's a good suggestion. And then you also had this optimality of criteria. Are these criteria optimal, or can they be more optimal? Does it mitigate insider ownership? Is what your comment was. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a response to that. I'll have to think about that. And Pradeep's questions. Match sample. We did try the match sample, and I don't know. We were running into issues with sample size. It was getting smaller, but Ajay's point is well taken. Maybe the smaller sample size gives, even with a good match, gives a better, stronger result. I agree. Maybe the Nifty or the CNX 200 is not appropriate. Maybe get those ones really close. But the really close was a problem. That we were losing a lot of firms. So yeah, we'll have to revisit. I'll have to look at what the results look like. Take the entire period, Pradeep's comment between the announcement and the actual. We didn't put it in the tables, but we added in the graph. So the graph started at -10 and goes all the way to 120. So in that, even between the announcement date and the delisting, the actual delisting date, you could see a downward trend. I don't know, just for brevity, we kind of knocked some of those out. But both are plots that I showed, the one with all the stocks and one with the MWPL based exclusions only, we have from -10 to 120. And we want to make sure that there's no reversal, because if there is reversal, then it's a pure liquidity price pressure story. But yeah, I mean, tables, I don't know, tables were getting long, so. And I don't know, I agree. Maybe we need to put some other way of maybe capturing the entire period in one row or something to give a better sense of what's happening. Price efficiency, it's not an intraday measure. So the way this measure works is, all they do is they take weekly stock returns and regress it on weekly market returns, and then 4 weeks lagged market returns. So you had like 5 independent variables, and we had like 2 years of data before the event and 2 years of data after the event. And basically you look at the, if efficiency goes down, then the impact of those lagged coefficients will be much higher, and that is what we find. So it is not an intraday measure, but variance of pricing error is volatility of pricing error. I don't know, that I need to look at it. It's been a while. But I think doesn't that apply only to intraday data? I don't know. I need to, okay, I'll take a look at that. No, it's listing and, okay, your question on delisting and delisting. The problem with the listing, delisting, which has been done by a lot of people in the US, is this paper by Mayhew and Mihov actually show that the listing decision itself is endogenous. So they look at firms that could have been listed based on criteria, but the exchange decided not to list it, and they find that there is some endogeneity, because the firms that actually do end up listing do see an upward trend, whereas the firms, if I remember right, if the firms were not, even though they met the criteria, they were not listed, I think were not, if I remember right. I forget that. It's kind of.
So the UK follows exactly the same rule which I said.
Okay.
So it's just mechanical.
Okay.
Based on market volume.
Okay.
The 105th drops off, the 95th comes in.
Sure.
It's completely predictable.
Yeah, but in the US, the exchange has some listing. So all the US-based studies, the listing and delisting is all endogenous. So that's the reason this is a cleaner. You're just you're increasing your limits, and then kind of the 50 firms drop out. So that's exogenous. Whereas the US studies are, because of this Mayhew and Mihov paper, there is they very clearly show there's endogeneity in the decision to list stocks in the options segment. But I don't know. Maybe we need to write it up and present it better. Point taken. And Arjay's point on discontinuing match sample, I agree. We need to look at it. I don't know. We were trying it at some point. I don't know what happened. We just got caught up in so many tables. And then there's always a debate which table should we put, and different authors, given 4 co-authors, people have different strong opinions. So, but point well taken. And Vardhana's point on, your point was decision to trade. Is there from a policy perspective, which segment do I trade? And given the tax, that's what, right? Given the tax differential, or did I
Not
miss
which
it?
segment do I trade, but when you give a policy recommendation,
Sure.
it should incorporate many more factors.
Many more factors.
This is
Okay.
more from the trader's perspective, the way I would see how
Sure.
is the price discovery happening between the spot and the derivatives kind
Okay.
of link.
Sure.
The conclusion that you come to, I
Is
feel
not
it's a bit
is
too,
not
it's
you're
too
not
strong.
too
for-
strong. Okay, we'll tone it
Because
down.
the reasons, I mean, in India, you've mentioned, I mean, it's 91% of the market is in the derivatives.
Derivatives, yeah.
Now, if you go by the standard laws of why a derivative product should be taken, it should be for hedging the underlying. If the trading currently derivatives to cash ratio is about 14 times. Now, if that is the high level of trading that's happening in the derivative market vis-a-vis an underlying which is very small, then are we talking like everything's happening because it's it's an efficient market? I mean, that kind of a thinking, or is it a price discovery simply that's happening, or is it speculation? I mean, you need some amount of speculation for price discovery, but what is that
much.
extent,
Okay,
and is
how
it
much?
too much? What is the reason why that's happening? So that's a different set of
Okay,
questions
fair enough.
that need to be addressed.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ram. And
Thanks a lot,
Vardhana,
yeah.
I confess, the title of the session is something I chose. So the markets and public policy is not Ram's fault. Yeah, so with that though, thank you, Ram. Thank you, Vardhana. Round of applause.